Hey, it's Justin from Davis 3D. I've made this tutorial as a guide to help you create optimized foliage for game engines. So before we start, I just want to take a quick look at an example I received from an employee. Now this texture is great. The poly count's good, the shape is alright, but the topology needs a little bit of work, and I think the shape of the plant itself probably needs a bit of work too. If you take a closer look at the topology, you can see that the edges don't really have much polys around them. And there's not really any edge flow that's occurring. It's sort of just going straight down as if everything's just been divided in a big grid. This is kind of suboptimal because it doesn't let you sculpt the shape of the plant very well. The plant ends up looking a bit flat, and the wind that affects the plant won't really look very natural. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create the plant from scratch in the way that I probably would have done things. And the way that I would have done things is thinking about the shape of the plant according to the texture and thinking about things like wind, thinking about things like optimization on topology, and just trying to minimize as much transparency as possible while keeping the overall shape of the plant and trying to keep the poly count relatively low at the same time. So there's a lot to think about, but as you'll see, it's not as complicated as it looks. I think you just need to follow the correct pipeline, the correct procedures, and your plant will be very optimized and look beautiful. So to start with, I'm just quickly cutting out all these leaves from the texture, so then I can start working on one as an example. Okay, so now we're going to cut around the edges of each leaf. Again, the poly count doesn't matter too much as long as the total plant polys is roughly under 10,000. For a plant like this, I think I would aim for around 3,000, which is the same as what the employee did to start with. For the sake of this tutorial, I'm not going to cut around every single leaf because that would take far too long. So instead, I'm just going to do one, but I'd like you to assume that I've done all of them. And in your own project, I'd like you to do all of the leaves that you have, just to create some variety in the plant. Now we're going to create the topology of the plant. The way I will be doing things is focusing on one half of the plant to start with, and then mirroring it later. The entire time I create the topology, I'll be considering how I'm going to add three-dimensionality to the 2D leaf. I want to follow the implied bumps and crevices that the texture contains. I also want to make sure that the flow of the topology allows the wind to interact with it properly, and I want the topology to be evenly distributed across the entire model. A simple way about thinking A simple way of thinking about the topology is not to think of the plant as a prop, but instead think of how you would retopologize the plant if it was a character. The plant is, after all, going to be animated, so the edge flow matters just as much as it would if it were a character. After you've done enough of the foundational topology, it's now time to start moving out the vertices to make the leaf more 3D. Doing so will help you recognize some areas of the topology that need extra work. The first half of the plant is done. A faster way of doing the other half is to mirror the mesh and then reset the UVs. This is only applicable to symmetrical leaves. Right now I'm editing the UVs to flip back the mirrored part and weld it with the original. Afterwards I'll be editing the topology again to fix up any minor differences. It's 3D. If you want to make the 3Dness more pronounced, you can, just scale it. If you do make it more pronounced, it'd be good not to have these sharp edges. So you can adjust the topology as needed, but I'm just going to make it a little bit more pronounced. Make sure to save. And before you do any extra adjustments, it's always good to make a copy. Just put it in a backup folder. And now you can start sculpting. So I usually use the bend tool to add some shape to the mesh. You can move the sides a bit inwards. Like so. And after you've finished doing that, if there's any hard edges, it's quite important to chamfer those, or use a swift loop tool often helps as well, just adding that extra topology that's needed. Same goes for any of these. If there's a bit of bumps, you can just add extra topology as needed. All right, so that is 308 triangles. It's a lot smoother. It's got proper topology for wind, and it's got very little transparency. Now, let's compare that. So it has more polys than this, but the shape is better. The topology is more streamlined for the wind. And I think overall, even if it does end up being higher polys, it's going to be worth it, given that it's got more artistic elements to it. The next stage of development is to position the leaves around to form a full plant. I'd recommend using instancing to start with, until you get a good idea of how your plant's overall shape will look. Instancing allows you to affect one leaf and it'll affect all the leaves. Afterwards, you can always make each leaf unique by sculpting them a bit more. I'll do that in the following example. All right, that looks like a pretty decent bush. Now the next stage, again, each time you do a stage, copy and put it into a new layer so you have an extra copy in case you need to make changes. Bush UVs. Let's call it bush UVs. Now we can essentially go and put the first UV channel and copy it to the second UV channel. And then you can make your light map by packing them accordingly. So we chuck a rotate on there to pack them properly. Or alternatively, I have a UV packer plugin that I use which packs them extremely well. So it gets the maximum resolution. Now we'll do the wind UVs. So we'll add a UV channel for number 3. And essentially what this is going to do is it's going to make the bottom part have no wind and the top part have the most wind. So alternatively, aside from just doing a planar, we can go back to 1 and go move that to 3 and then just drag it so that the bottom doesn't have wind and the top has wind. So the top is completely white, so if we want this entire leaf part to have wind, we essentially need to squish that down and then drag it up so that this top part has all wind and this bottom part has no wind. The same applies for the stems. If we don't want these having any wind at all, just drag them down and then drag them accordingly. So that is all done. I'm going to export that as an FBX and show you what it looks like in the level. Drag that guy in. You can do LOD groups to start with. I do large prop. Even though this is going to be small, a large prop has the effect of having 4 LODs instead of 3, and the screen size distance between each LOD is more appropriate. I'll drag in the opacity, the normals, and an ambient occlusion. So we didn't check the scale, but it seems like it's good scale. So I'm just going to create a quick default material. I'm going to drag in our 3 textures, plug the normal in, plug the opacity in, and let's make this a linear gradient. We're just going to lerp between 2 colors and multiply it. Color 1, let's make that green. Color 2, can make that blue. And for the linear gradient, you can see how it's being applied to the whole texture like this. What we can do is we can do a texture coordinate, and we can use the UV coordinate 3 because we have a UV coordinate 3 on our plant that we made for the wind, and so that'll let us put the blue at the bottom and the green at the top. Now, as for the wind, I have a bunch of wind gradients. I picked them accordingly, but I think for this one we will pick this one. Should be good. So we'll plug that into UV3. We're going to multiply that by simple grass wind. We can plug that into the world position offset and add our wind intensity. Add speed, let's make that 0.2. Just add 0 for that. So as you can see, it's making the bottom windy. We can easily fix this with a lerp. we just reverse. So A is 1, B is 0. What this does is it just flips the grayscale, so it's going to make the top windy. Now, that gradient didn't work, so let's see if we can grab a different one. There we go. So we found a gradient that worked better. The intensity is probably too strong, so let's make 0.3. The different gradient didn't have the flipping issues, so I got rid of that. Let's make that 0.6, and we'll also make this a where is it? Blend mode masked. There we go. So now the texture will mask it accordingly. Can make the roughness a little bit more shiny. Make the specular 1. And one extra thing, we got to make this a subsurface. Subsurface allows the light to shine through the back, and we'll add SSS opacity. This controls the thickness of it, so if it's like 0.8, it's going to be way more thick. And the other thing is, we could have picked two-sided foliage as well, that's an option, but subsurface often works better, so I'm just going to click the two-sided tick box here and hit save. And we got to apply our material. We'll make a material instance so we can edit thing. Pop that on there, hit save. Can add a simple sphere collision. In the collision properties, I can do no collision or collision enabled, but under the collision presets, we can do overlap all. So it's not going to block the player, but the player can still detect the plant in case they want to like pick it, put it in their inventory. And now, if we drag this into the foliage tool, we can paint our plant. You can change the scale so that it's random. And there you have it. That's how to create optimized foliage for game engines.